actually finish up the book of Daniel. We'll cover a lot of scriptural territory, so we'll go through it a little fast, but I hope you'll find that interesting. Let's pray, though, before we dive into that, and then we'll look at how the book of Daniel ends. Father, we're just so grateful for today. We thank you and praise you. We ask that you would bless this time as we examine your word, that your Spirit would guide us and help us to understand it, that you would open our minds to see your greatness and how you predicted the future, which is now our history, but also the future that is still to come, and how you work and intertwine those together, because you know all things and see all things and hold all time within your hands. Father, we just ask you to help us to see your greatness and goodness and worship you as a result and live for you as a result. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, God ended the book of Daniel with something of a cliffhanger, you might say. Kind of like a movie that, is going to have a sequel. I think the one that stood out in my mind was Lord of the Rings. You're watching through it and the screen just goes black. And you got to wait till the next one comes out. I mean, it just kind of, they do it that way. Daniel's a little bit that way in the way it ends. And so we're going to look today at what God told us about how the world, as we know it, would end, and what information he sealed up, you might say marked classified, until the time of the end was near. So hang on, we are going to cover a lot of material. We're going to cover it kind of fast, but you'll see that God revealed to Daniel what was to come, some of which is going to happen still in the future for us. So let's get started. We'll finish the book of Daniel today, and we're going to cover 2 chapters. Okay, so that's a lot of material to cover. But before you panic about that and say, I'm not ready to do 2 whole chapters in one day. Let me tell you, while the prophecy was future to Daniel, when Daniel was given this prophecy, it was all future to him. Much of it to us is now ancient history. And so we can kind of read through it and kind of quickly, move on, commenting just, and this is when it happened, but it's history to us, and so we should be able to move fast through that. The second chapter, though, is really short, chapter 12, and so that's also why I wanted to just kind of do it together. And technically, if you read through it, chapters 10, 11, and 12 are all one unit, one conversation. Now, let me tell you up front, the book of Daniel is heavily criticized by scholars and critics, not because it's errors that are in it, but because it's too accurate. Okay, it's astoundingly accurate. And so they say it couldn't have been written at the time Daniel says, because he would have had to have known the future in order to write this, because it's too accurate. Now, last I checked, that's kind of the point of prophecy, is God is saying, this is what's going to happen in the future. And so, in fact, that is the challenge God's give. This is in Isaiah chapter 41, verse 23, the first half. He's speaking to the pagan idols. He says, tell us the coming events, then we'll know that you are gods. He throws down this challenge to the pagan idols. He says, hey, I'm going to tell you what's coming. Let's hear you tell us what's coming so we'll know you're real. God can do that because God knows all time. He can tell you the future. He already knows what's going to happen. Not what might happen, not what could happen. He doesn't just have all the probable things of the multiverse. God knows what's going to happen. And God is never caught by surprise. He never picks up the morning paper and is shocked at the latest headline. Oh no, I can't believe this happened. See, that doesn't happen to God. God knows tomorrow as well as He knows yesterday. And so He's not caught off guard. He can tell what's going to happen. And so He sent Daniel a vision. That's where we are here in chapter 10, 11, and 12. He sends Daniel a vision showing him what would happen in the future. We looked last week at Daniel. He was greatly disturbed by what he had seen in this vision, and he spent 3 weeks praying, and a being came from God to explain the vision. We saw that last week. We saw how that being appeared and provided some insight into the spiritual conflict that was happening behind the scenes. And so if you missed that message is on YouTube. It's available. But today we're going to look at the explanation of the vision Daniel had. This being came to Daniel, and he gives him the explanation. And so we're going to jump right in. This is Daniel chapter 11. We'll pick up in verse 2. Now I tell you the truth, 3 more kings will arise in Persia, and the fourth will be far richer than the others. By the power he gains through his riches, he will stir up everyone against the kingdom of Greece. Now, according to Daniel's testimony, this explanation would have been given to him in about 536 years before Christ. Okay, he's in the 3rd year of King Cyrus when he has this vision and this being comes and explains it to him. The events he describes don't begin to take place for at least another 40 years. That's when the Persians begin to invade the Greek states and their territories. What we're probably most familiar with is the Battle of Thermopylae, where 300 Spartans try to hold off the Persian army. Have you heard about that, the 300? Okay. I think there's a movie. I've not seen any of the movies, but you know, it's kind of popular these days. That battle would have taken place about 55 years after Daniel wrote these words. So God is telling him up front, Daniel, the Persian kings, you're going to have these kings, and they're going to start warring against Greece. That's what's going to happen. And so over the next 50 years, that is what happens. Then this being continues to explain, verse 3, then a warrior king will arise. He will rule a vast realm and do whatever he wants. But as soon as he is established, his kingdom will be broken up and divided to the 4 winds of heaven, but not to his descendants. It will not be the same kingdom that he ruled, because his kingdom will be uprooted and will go to others besides him. Now clearly in these next 2 verses, we jump ahead in history. What it describes is Alexander the Great, a warrior king who arose in Greece and led Greece against a war of revenge against the Persians. Greece, as you know, conquered Persia, and after which Alexander died. Okay, this is basic history class, you know, World Civilization 101. But Alexander didn't leave his empire to his descendants. Instead, it was divided into 4 parts. They divided it north, south, east, and west and gave it to his top 4 generals. They say what Alexander wished is that whoever was strongest would replace him, but they didn't agree on who was the strongest, so they split it up. This would have happened about 100 years after Daniel wrote these words. So guys, in 3 verses, we've covered 100 years. We're moving quick. Daniel is then told of events that would take place and the infighting between these kingdoms, and the focus of scriptural prophecy is between the kingdom of the north and the kingdom of the south, which would be the Ptolemy and the Seleucid kingdoms. You're all up to speed with the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, right? Okay, I knew you'd be with me. The Ptolemy dynasty was in what we would know as Egypt. Okay, one of the generals got that southern part down there in Africa, the kingdom of the south. The Seleucid dynasty is what we would probably know as more Syria, Turkey. One of the generals got that more northern area, and then one got the west over where Greece is, and one got the east over where Iraq and Iran are. These guys fought for generations to prove who was the strongest. They had war with each other. There wasn't a unified empire of Greece after Alexander died. It broke up into different kingdoms. And often, particularly between the kingdom of Egypt and the kingdom of Syria, the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, Jerusalem was caught in the middle. It's there between Egypt and Syria. And so when they would fight one another, Jerusalem will be caught in the middle. And that's where the biblical focus is. We really don't see anything else about the western kingdom much or the eastern kingdom much. What we hear about in this chapter is that northern and southern kingdom that are fighting over the beautiful land, over Israel, over Jerusalem. And so we're going to go ahead and go through this and just see if you can follow along. This is the history of the Greek wars in Syria. Like, that's your favorite topic, right? Okay, well, I knew you'd be up to speed, but this is the history. This is what the being told Daniel would happen and what does happen. Verse 5, Daniel chapter 11. The king of the south will grow powerful, hence the one down in Egypt, but one of his commanders will grow more powerful and will rule a kingdom greater than his. After some years, they will form an alliance, and the daughter of the king of the south will go to the king of the north to seal the agreement. They often married off their daughters to seal treaties, kind of a deal. She will not retain power, and his strength will not endure. She will be given up together with her entourage, her father, and the one who supported her during those times. In the place of the king of the south, one of her family will rise up, come against the army, and enter into the fortress of the king of the north. He will take action against them and triumph. He will take even their gods captive to Egypt, with their metal images and their precious articles of silver and gold. For some years he will stay away from the king of the north, who will enter the kingdom of the king of the south and then return to his own land. His sons will mobilize for war and assemble a large number of armed forces. They will advance sweeping through like a flood and will again wage war as far as his fortresses. Infuriated, the king of the south will march out to fight the king of the north, who will raise a large army, but they will be handed over to his enemy. When the army is carried off, he will become arrogant and cause tens of thousands to fall, but he will not triumph. The king of the north will raise a multitude larger than the first. After some years, he will advance with the great army and many supplies. In those times, many will rise up against the king of the south. Violent ones among your own people will assert themselves to fulfill a vision, but they will fail. Then the king of the north will come and build a siege ramp and capture the well-fortified city. The forces of the south will not stand. Even their select troops will not be able to resist. The king of the north who comes against him will do whatever he wants, and no one can oppose him. He will establish himself in the beautiful land, and total destruction in his hand. He will resolve to come with the force of his whole kingdom, and he will reach an agreement with him. He will give him a daughter in marriage to destroy it, but she will not stand with him or support him. Then he will turn his attention to the coast and the islands to capture many, but a commander will put an end to his taunting. Instead, he will turn his taunts against him. He will turn his attention back to the fortresses of his own land, and he will stumble, fall, and be no more. Short story, they're going to fight a whole lot. Okay? Back and forth. Verse 20. In his place, one will arise who will send out a tax collector. Even back then they got tax collector. Okay. Tax collector for the glory of the kingdom, but within a few days he will be broken, though not in anger or battle. In his place, a despised person will arise. Royal honors will not be given to him, but he will come during a time of peace and seize the kingdom by intrigue. A flood of forces will be swept away before him. They will be broken as well as the covenant prince. After an alliance is made with him, he will act deceitfully. He will rise to power with a small nation. During a time of peace, he will come into the richest parts of the province and do what his fathers and predecessors never did. He will lavish plunder, loot, and wealth on his followers, and he will make plans against fortified cities, but only for a time. With a large army, he will stir up his power and his courage against the king of the south. So again, they're going to fight against Egypt. The king of the south will prepare for battle with an extremely large and powerful army, but he will not succeed because plots will be made against him. Those who eat his provisions will destroy him, and his army will be swept away, and many will fall slain. The two kings, whose hearts are bent on evil, will speak lies at the same table, but to no avail, for still the end will come at the appointed time. They're going to have these two kings, these two politicians are going to meet, and they're just going to sit there lying to one another. That could be in the newspaper today. Okay, verse 28. The king of the north will return to his land with great wealth, but his heart will be set against the holy covenant. He will take action and then return to his own land. At the appointed time, he will come again to the south, but this time will not be like the first. Ships of Kittim will come against him, and being intimidated, he will withdraw. Then he will rage against the Holy Covenant and take action. On his return, he will favor those who abandon the Holy Covenant. His forces will rise up and desecrate the temple fortress. They will abolish the regular sacrifice and set up the abomination of desolation. With flattery, he will corrupt those who act wickedly toward the covenant, but the people who know their God will be strong and take action. Those who have insight among the people will give understanding to many, yet they will fall by the sword and flame, and they will be captured and plundered for a time. When they fall, they will be helped by some, but many others will join them insincerely. Some of those who have insight will fall so that they may be refined, purified, and cleansed until the time of the end. For I will still come at the appointed time. Then the king will do whatever he wants. He will exalt and magnify himself above every god. And he will say outrageous things against the God of gods. He will be successful until the time of wrath is completed, because what he has decreed will be accomplished. He will not show regard for the gods of his ancestors or the God desired by women or any other god, because he will magnify himself above all. Instead, he will honor a God of fortresses, a God his ancestors did not know, with gold, silver, precious stones, and riches. He will deal with the strongest fortresses with the help of a foreign god. He will greatly honor those who acknowledge him, making them rulers over many and distributing land as a reward. At that time, at the time of the end, the king of the south will engage him in battle, and the king of the north will storm against his with chariots, horsemen, and many ships. He will invade countries and sweep through them like a flood. He will also invade the beautiful land, and many will fall. But these will escape from his power: Edom, Moab, and the prominent people of the Ammonites. He will extend his power against the countries, and not even the land of Egypt will escape. He will get control of hidden treasures of gold and silver, and over the riches of Egypt, the Libyans and the Cushites will be in submission. But reports from the east and the north will terrify him, and he will go out with great fury to annihilate and completely destroy many. He will pitch his royal tents between the sea and the beautiful holy mountain, but he will meet his end with no one to help him. Wasn't that exciting? Okay, that covers about 300 years of history. The back and forth battles between the Ptolemy and the Seleucid kingdoms, and does end alluding to the king of the north, who would set against the Holy Covenant. He was against the Holy Covenant and against the people. Most certainly, much of this prophecy applies to Antiochus IV, known as Antiochus Epiphanes. He was a Greek ruler of the Seleucid Empire who came to power there in the Syria area. He persecuted the Jews. He waged war against the Ptolemies in Egypt. He desecrated the temple, even sacrificing a pig on the altar. He put a statue of Zeus in the temple with his own face on it and demanded to be worshipped. He placed himself above all these others. This would also be a fulfillment of the little horn raising, being raised up in the vision of the ram and the goat that we looked at back in Daniel chapter 8. We saw that the four horns of the goat would be broken off, and then one ram, or the horn would be broken off, and four would replace it, and then the one little horn would take its place and speak arrogantly. This would be Antiochus Epiphanes. He was a type of Antichrist. If any of what we read sounded familiar, does some of that sound like the Antichrist? I mean, as you're going through it, there's a reason for that. We'll get to that in a second. But he would have been a type of the Antichrist. He persecuted God's people and enticed them to abandon God's covenant. In fact, this is what sets up the cultural details when we get to the time of Jesus. There's a strong friction between the Jewish people who were strictly Jewish, the Hebraic Jews, and those who were Hellenistic, those who had adapted to Greek culture. and the Roman world and lived like Romans, but were still religiously Jewish. You see that throughout the New Testament, this friction. Well, this is what causes this friction, is Antiochus Epiphanes entices people to abandon God's covenant, to adapt and adopt Greek clothing, Greek food, Greek ways of life, and as a result, he would promote them. He would give them positions. He would give them land. He would give them wealth if they would do that. But if they stayed true to God, if they said, no, we're going to be Jewish, no, we're going to follow God's covenant, no, we're going to worship God only, then he would persecute them, even kill them. And so Antiochus Epiphanes kind of set up that cultural thing that we see in the New Testament, but he wants to be worshiped. Now what happened was the Jews under the Maccabees, those who understood God's law, rebelled against him. They overthrew Antiochus Epiphanes to some degree. They liberated the temple and liberated Jerusalem. They established a temple, and that's part of what they celebrate at Hanukkah. Okay, you guys heard about Hanukkah? I mean, okay, that's part of what they celebrate, was the cleansing of the temple, and God did a miracle for them, and they only had enough oil for one day, but God made it last for 8 days, and that's why they have an 8-day festival every winter, celebrating what God did in the temple. Now this all comes to an end with the Ptolemy dynasty in Egypt, and basically what they did is they made an alliance with the Romans, who were coming and conquering from the west. Likely this is the ships of Kittim mentioned in verse 30, and the Seleucid dynasty is eventually conquered. In our history books we kind of put this, y'all heard of Cleopatra? Okay, she was one of the Ptolemy rulers down in Egypt, one of the Greek dynasty. And so she made a treaty with Mark Antony, and so they fought against the Seleucids, which were the ones up in Syria, the Greeks up there. So, for us, this is kind of history, and eventually the Romans conquer it all. They take it all. Now, unless you're a student of the ancient Greek wars in Syria, and I find most Americans are not, I mean, beyond what they've seen in a few movies, okay? This may seem a little dry. I mean, okay, it's great. God told Daniel it was going to happen. Some of this, a couple hundred years before it happened, some of it 50 years before it happened. God told Daniel, some of it almost 400 years before it happened. It's amazing. God knew what was going to happen. He gave all this detail, but to us, it's history. Well, it is important to understand God did reveal it long before it happened. God showed his power to Daniel, revealing what would happen. However, from the teachings of Jesus, we also know that this prophecy still has future components. It's a dual fulfillment prophecy. Now, a lot of prophecies are. There's prophecies particularly related to the Messiah and the Antichrist that seem to have this. History repeats itself. We looked at that previously, and it seems that sometimes prophecies repeat themselves in their fulfillment. While many of these things were fulfilled by Antiochus Epiphanes, we can look at the history books and we can see how he did exactly what was described here in Daniel chapter 11. There is still the future prediction of the little horn and the vision of the four beasts that we saw in Daniel chapter 7. See, the ram and the goat, we saw that. We represented Persia and Greece, and we saw that Greece was going to come conquer Persia. I mean, Daniel foretold that, before it happened, and that the horn would be broken off and replaced with 4 horns. The 4 generals would replace Alexander the Great. We saw that already in history. Then a little horn would rise up and speak blasphemous things. That was Antiochus Epiphanes. All that's history to us, and it was part of Daniel's prophecy. But there's also the prophecy of the beast that overtakes Persia and overtakes Greece, which we would see as Rome, that also has a little horn that pops up. Remember the 10 horns and the little horn that comes out of that? And so the vision of Daniel 7 has not yet been fulfilled. Jesus was asked by his disciples what the sign of the end of the age would be and what the sign of his coming would be. And this is part of his response. We're going to go real quick to Matthew chapter 24, verse 15. Jesus said this. He said, "So when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place," Matthew adds, "let the reader understand." Now, didn't we just read that? We just read about the abomination of desolation standing in the temple. We just discussed that that's history of what Antiochus Epiphanes did. They celebrate Hanukkah. That was before Jesus. Okay? Jesus says, when you see this happen, the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand, then those in Judea must flee to the mountains. A man on the housetop must not come down to get things out of his house. A man in the field must not go back to get his coat. In other words, when you see this happen, run for your life. Get out of town. Verse 19, woe to the pregnant woman and the nursing mothers in those days. Pray that your escape may not be in winter or on a Sabbath, for at that time there will be great distress, the kind that hasn't taken place from the beginning of the world until now, and never will again. Unless those days were cut short, no one would be saved. But those days will be cut short because of the elect. The abomination of desolation was an event that took place almost 200 years before Jesus spoke these words. But he speaks of it as something that's going to happen in the future, that's coming up. This timeline probably seems a little confusing. In fact, Matthew, I think that's why he added the comment, let the reader understand. Jesus is saying a past event's going to happen in the future. In fact, he may have been dealing with the same detail Daniel was trying to understand. How does this happen twice? How can the same event, such a horrible event where God's people are persecuted, where the temple is desecrated, where this abomination of a man proclaiming himself to be God, how can this happen twice? And the answer would seem to be that there's two antichrists in history. We see Antiochus Epiphanes appear before Jesus comes. The Antichrist, the whole story of Hanukkah, the whole thing, all that happens leading up to Jesus coming to the temple. But there will be a second right before the second coming of Christ, the Antichrist. The one that will make Antiochus look better. I mean, the Antichrist will be there before the second coming of Christ. It happens twice. It happens twice. Now this would go well with what the messenger says in his closing explanation. Partly it fits well. There's kind of a spot in there where, you kind of see the divergence and you see the New Testament using the same language for the Antichrist that we see Daniel using for, this person that committed these abominations. But look at Daniel chapter 12, picking up in verse 1. This divine messenger still speaking to Daniel. He says, at that time, Michael the great prince, who stands watch over your people, will rise up. There will be a time of distress, such as never has occurred since the nations came into being until that time. Isn't that what Jesus just said? That's exactly what Jesus says in Matthew 24. Continuing on, but at that time, all your people who are found written in the book will escape. Many who sleep in the dust of the earth will awake, some to eternal life, and some to disgrace and eternal contempt. The resurrection. Those who have insight will shine like the bright expanse of the heavens, and those who led many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. And so we're in kind of a unique perspective today, being the church, living here in 2021. We're caught between the 69 weeks of Daniel, which were completed leading up to Jesus entering Jerusalem. We looked at the 70 weeks of Daniel. We saw that there are 69 that were completed leading up to Jesus entering Jerusalem. But the 70th week, that one last week, we're in the great parenthesis between the weeks, is when the great tribulation comes. We're in the moment of grace where God has opened the door to the world to come to Christ, to hear the gospel, to be saved. We're in the moment before the end. But guys, the end is coming. That last week, that last great tribulation, that last 7 years, it's coming. The day will come where we get there. And so Daniel chapter 11 to us seems mostly like history because mostly a large degree it is. But chapter 12, which is right in the middle of the explanation, to us is the future. Even though it's in the same vision. See, we're caught in between. Does that make sense? Where we're at in time. The day is still coming at which Jesus foretold his disciples, the day when a time of distress such as never occurred since the nations came into being until then. Guys, we've had rough times. This last year, my wife and I were just talking, this last year has been kind of a rough year. I mean, it's been good. God's been good to us. He's been faithful. He's seen us through it. But I don't know about you. I've been stressed this last year. Any of you had any stress this last year? Or did you enjoy your year-long vacation at home? I mean, what, I don't know. I felt the way. In fact, I was looking at some videos from a year ago. I've grayed a lot in the last year. I guess that's okay. But we haven't seen anything yet. The day's coming where there's going to be a time of distress unlike anything the world has ever known. In fact, Jesus said if the time wasn't cut short, no one would survive. At that time, this being tells Daniel, at that time, Michael, the archangel, will rise up to defend the nation of Israel, after which will come the resurrection and final judgment. By the way, you want an Old Testament passage that talks about the resurrection? Well, here's one of them. There are passages, but here's one of them. The resurrection and the final judgment will occur. This is clearly future to us. And he kind of, in a way, goes back to what we looked at the beginning in chapter 10, where he starts talking about that spiritual behind the scenes. Remember, this being comes to Daniel. He says, Michael came and helped me fight against the prince of Persia. That's how I got here. And now we're back to Michael rising up to defend the nation of Israel, this behind the scenes spiritual look that we saw in chapter 10. Now, if any of this seems confusing to you, that's okay. Okay? Truth is, we weren't meant to completely understand it until the time of the end. That's what they tell Daniel next. Look at verse 4 of Daniel chapter 12. But you, Daniel, keep these words secret and seal the book until the time of the end. Many will roam about and knowledge will increase. See, God gave this message to Daniel, but I think its meaning would in many ways remain secret until the time of the end. I don't think we understood what was coming. We were not necessarily meant to understood what was coming. And Jesus began unlocking this when he explained to his disciples the abomination of desolation was still a future event. The book of Revelation goes a long way towards explaining even more of it, putting it into perspective and understanding how this would continue. But the book of Daniel ends with a mystery. A mystery that will only be revealed in its proper time. And to be honest with you, I don't know that we fully understand it yet. See, people are roaming about, knowledge is increasing, it's exactly what was described to Daniel, but this may continue to remain shrouded in mystery until the time of the end finally comes. Well, when will that be? That's the next question they answer. Look at verse 5, Daniel chapter 12, verse 5. Then I, Daniel, looked at the other two who were standing there, one on this bank of the river and one on the other. One of them said to the man dressed in linen, who was above the water of the river, "How long until the end of these wondrous things?" And then I heard the man dressed in linen, who was above the water of the river. He raised both hands toward heaven and swore by him who lives eternally that it would be for a time, times, and a half time. When the power of the holy people is shattered, all these things will be completed. When will this happen? During the time, times, and a half time. Have we heard that term before? In fact, that's a pretty common as we refer towards the Great Tribulation, the 3.5 years that we read about in Revelation. When will we get to the last 3.5 years of the Great Tribulation? I think that is when it will be completely unsealed, and this will make sense. I really don't know if the full meaning of this prophecy will be completely and clearly understood until we get to that point. Maybe it's one of those things you got to be there. And I don't know about you, I'd rather not be there. But when we get to the Great Tribulation. Now, if you still have questions about this and how it's all going to work out, you're not alone, you're in good company. Daniel had questions too. Look at verse 8. He said, I heard, but I did not understand. Anybody with Daniel? Okay, he heard, but he did not understand. So I asked, my Lord, what will the outcome of these things be? He said, go on your way, Daniel, for the words are secret and sealed until the time of the end. Many will be purified, cleansed, and refined, but the wicked will act wickedly. None of the wicked will understand. The world's going to scoff. They're not going to understand what Daniel was saying. But those who have insight will understand. From the time the daily sacrifice is abolished and the abomination of desolation is set up, there will be 1,290 days. Happy is the one who waits for and reaches 1,335 days. But as for you, go on your way to the end. You will rest, and then you will rise to receive your allotted inheritance at the end of the days. See, God's revealed His plan. That doesn't mean we're always going to understand it. We may not always understand what God's saying, but He's revealed it. We may have a lot of questions, and that's okay. But what we must not do is let those questions distract from what we do know. God's given us a lot of information. We may not always understand it, but focus on what you do know. Some things are secret and are sealed until the time of the end. I like to call these a theological nunya. That's kind of what Daniel's told us here. It's none your business. He said, hey, what's going to be the outcome? Daniel, go on your way. I've given you what you're going to get. This is what's going to happen, but you may not understand it. It's not for you to understand. It's for you to write down for later. What is our business, just like Daniel, is to go on living for God in the life He's given us. Daniel ends his book with a mystery. Now, I know we read prophecy books, we want to solve mysteries. We want to understand the riddle. But understand that Daniel is ended specifically with a sealed mystery. This is an important lesson about prophecy. See, God in His grace has revealed much of what is to come. He has done so for our comfort. We see that in Thessalonians, where we are to comfort one another with the reality that Jesus is coming back, the reality of the resurrection of the dead. We're to comfort one another with the things God has foretold, but He also has revealed it for His glory. God has shown His power. He can predict the future, not predict what might happen, but predict what will happen because He's enthroned. He is in control. But none of that should allow us to get so focused on prophecy that we fail to live for Jesus today. Prophecy is good. That's why God gave it to us. But it should not distract us from living for Jesus. Because we are still to live today. That's what Daniel was told. Go live the rest of your life, Daniel. You'll be resurrected to your reward, Daniel. I know a lot of believers who, in fact, most believers down through the last 2,000 years have been convinced that they were in the last days. Now, we're getting closer. There's some things that tell me we're really close because Israel's a nation again. That makes me think we're really close. I'm watching for him to build the temple. I figure a temple's got to be there if the Antichrist is going to walk in the temple and declare himself to be God. There's got to be a temple. So I'm watching. We're getting closer. But the truth is, I don't know whether I'll be there to see this or not. I do know I will be there when Jesus calls for the resurrection. We will be there when Jesus calls for the resurrection. So whatever happens between here and there, let's focus on what we do know, and that's living for Jesus. The prophet Daniel ends his writings with us not being told everything. We don't know everything that's going to happen. God does, but we don't. We know that God knows, and we know that we can trust Him. God leaves us in a situation of faith. We're going to put our trust in Him. God's got it under control. He knows what He's doing. I'm going to believe in Jesus and trust Him, come what may. Will there be turbulent times? Yes, there probably will. Will there be pandemics on the earth? Well, yes. Earthquakes and famines and plagues? Yes. But I'm going to tell you, at the end of all of it, Jesus is coming back. We also know from the closing remarks of Daniel that we should live our life in a way that honors God, because the day will come where everyone, as we see in Revelation, but we see here in Daniel, everyone will be resurrected from the dead. Some will stand judgment before God. Some will be raised to their reward. Others will be raised to judgment and contempt. That's what this being tells Daniel. Are we ready for that day? Are we ready for the day Jesus comes back? Are we ready for the day of the resurrection when we all stand before the throne of God and account? Have you put your faith in Jesus, the Messiah, the one Daniel foretold of? See, He's the resurrection and the life. He's the one who's going to call us out of the grave. Have you put your faith in Him? Because if not, I'm going to tell you, all the prophecy studies in the world is great, it's fun, but I'm going to tell you, unless you believe in Jesus, it's not going to do you any good. It's not enough to fill your head with what prophecies are. You need to fill your heart with Jesus.